From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about what the Biden administration can do to reduce regional tensions and proxy conflict in the Middle East. It's an important and complicated issue, but thankfully I'm joined today by two great guests who can help unpack things, Paul Salem and Ross Harrison. Paul is MEI's president, Ross is a senior fellow and the director of research here at MEI, and he's also on the faculty of the political science department at the University of Pittsburgh. Paul, Ross, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, Alistair.
Paul, let's start with you. Before we delve in any further, can you give our listeners a brief overview of the current state of play in the region? What are the major sources of tension, and where are they playing out in the form of proxy conflicts?
Yeah, the way I like to sort of look at that is look both horizontally and vertically. By horizontally, I mean, what are the issues and problems, horizontally across the region, between the countries and so on. And that is really defined by the absence of any regional order. It's a completely disordered region. It's a region at war with itself. You might say it's a region in civil war as a region. It has a number of axes of conflict. To tick off just a few, Iran is in conflict with the US in the region, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, and a few others. Turkey, and until recently, Qatar was in conflict with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. There is the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, elements of the Israeli-Arab conflict. Obviously, there's been breakthroughs there under the Trump administration. There's also an ideological conflict sort of within the Islamic world between radical or extremely radical Islamists and more moderate or even secular trends. You see that it erupted in Egypt, erupted in Syria. It's erupting all over the place. So there's a lot of conflict across the region. You layer over that, problems of COVID and unemployment and climate change. So it's a region which has a lot of distress. The vertical aspect is something that you can link to the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, the Arab Winter, whatever you want to call it. The fact that many of the nation states of the region have internal contradictions and dysfunctions, driven a lot of them partly by socioeconomic pressures, high demographic growth, high unemployment, strong income inequality, high levels of corruption. And you saw those protests and so on partly express those social and economic grievances. And you also have political dysfunction in that the vast majority of these countries are authoritarian systems, either military authoritarian or one family rule, monarchies of different kind, or one party rule, and populations that are demanding more freedom, generally more participation, more say in their lives. In some cases, this transitioned into tentative democracy, like in Tunisia. In other places, it was repressed, like in Egypt or Bahrain. So the nation states as well are struggling. It's a very, remains, I would say, the most dysfunctional region in the world. And its problems radiate globally, obviously, through terrorism and other problems. So it remains a high concern for the U.S.
Ross, the region is also facing deeper structural problems at this particular historical moment in time. How do those factor into this equation?
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, if you think back on the history of the Middle East, the structure of the Middle East largely has adapted to or been shaped by outside powers historically, going back to the colonial period. The British and the French colonized much of the region and set the boundaries that we live with today. In terms of Iran, it was Great Britain and Russia, then later the Soviet Union. And then as we transition into the Cold War, it was largely the agenda-setting power of the United States and the Soviet Union that kind of set the polarity or set the structure of the Middle East. I think the thing that's important to keep in mind as we transition to a Biden administration is that the region is now transforming itself. It's an ugly transformation. It's a violent transformation, but it is a transformation, and it's taking place largely according to its own logic. And while it can be influenced by outside powers, the basic transformation itself is occurring internally. And I think that's, if there's any good news that we can see for the region, is that it is an internal transformation, and therefore the powers that are driving that transformation in the region, largely the great powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran that Paul mentioned, Turkey, and even some of the lesser powers. Those powers are going to be driving the future of the region. And I think it's important for as we start thinking about the next 4 years, that the Biden administration needs to internalize that they can help shape or adapt to or help influence the region. But the dynamic of how the region is going to unfold is largely going to be driven by local powers. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind is there's a tendency to personalize the conflict in the Middle East, to say that Iran is the source of the problem in Yemen, or Saudi Arabia is the source of the problem in Yemen, or Turkey is part of the source of the problem in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's a tendency to personalize this conflict and the region itself. And I think if we think about this process of transformation, of a structural transformation, it kind of depersonalizes and says, yes, there is blame to go around in each individual conflict of who is the protagonist in that conflict. But basically, all of the actors, all of the powerful actors in the region, the ones that I just mentioned, are also responding to this structural transformation. They're driving it, but they're also responding to it. And I think it's important to understand that if we're thinking about the U.S. role, we need to be thinking about what a constructive role would be given that kind of transformation.
Well, looking ahead to the next 4 years, the new administration won't be starting with a blank slate. It'll have to deal with the accumulated effects, the baggage, if you will, of the Trump and Obama administrations. What impact have those had on America's leverage and clout in the region? And what does that mean for the Biden administration's efforts?
Well, we should start by saying that, the Biden administration acknowledges that the U.S. has enduring interest in the Middle East. It's not leaving, it's not walking away, even though it has obviously tremendous domestic priorities. It has huge foreign policy priorities on climate change and COVID and China. So Middle East doesn't figure very high in their agenda, but it's certainly there, and there's enduring interest in maintaining the flow of energy, commerce, and trade through the Middle East, and that's largely, partly Persian Gulf, but also partly Red Sea, and it, sort of undergirds American sort of naval and military presence, making sure that all sea lanes and trade and energy flows are continuing. An enduring interest in making sure Iran and other countries, one must note, other than Israel, do not get weapons of mass destruction. That was, a motivating factor for both administrations that preceded Biden. There is an enduring counterterrorism concern, which implies continued deployments around the region. There is a sort of emerging focus on great power competition. What that means in the Middle East is that making sure that the Middle East doesn't become, over the years, China's zone of influence and something that China dominates, but rather the U.S. maintains a strong position. There is a major concern about Russia becoming dominant. There's concern about its presence here and there, but China is the big concern in the long term. And there's an interest in ending the endless wars. So the concerns, the interests are enduring. They were there under Trump. They were there, under Obama to many degrees. The legacy from Trump and Obama, or what are the strengths and weaknesses, let's say, as Biden comes into office? I think the strengths are many. The U.S., despite everything, remains the single most influential state in the Middle East, more powerful militarily than anybody else, more influence politically, and its alliance system and so on. So remains a very, very major player despite setbacks and despite many problems. The weaknesses as well have accumulated. One is, I would say, a question of time, in the sense that American political time moves very quickly, and the countries of the region have to deal with, every 4 years, a new U.S. administration, sometimes a shift in policy. that weakens America's hand. If they want to negotiate something, that's a problem. If they want to put pressure, that's a problem, because every 4 years, it changes. This has also become a problem that some of American foreign policy has become politicized internally. We saw this with Trump and the nuclear deal, and hence foreign policy gets caught up in domestic squabbles, and that's not good for American credibility abroad. You could almost say that, the U.S. is very powerful, but to use a phrase that was used for the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, the United States is now the sick man of North America. It's powerful, but it has a lot of problems, not very reliable, shifts a lot of weaknesses. One particular weakness that the Biden administration wants to overcome is the undermining of the idea of negotiations and diplomacy, particularly that happened in the Trump years. And obviously, we saw this in the nuclear deal and walking away from a deal that America itself negotiated under Obama. This means that for Iran, or frankly for any other player, if they are to negotiate and try to make a deal with the United States, that deal is only good for a couple of years, and then it might go up in smoke. The general effect of that is it encourages states in the region, rather than to rely increasingly and encourage them to rely on negotiation, diplomacy, and agreements, it encourages them to rely on taking what you want by force. And this is a pattern that was reinforced in the Trump administration's dealing with Israel, that's saying whatever Israel seizes by force, whether the Golan Heights or settling Palestinian lands in the West Bank, as long as they're powerful and they seize it, America is okay with that. Iran is, using force in Lebanon and many other places to take things, and it's encouraged other players like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, one might say ISIS, just to go ahead and, do what you can by force. And that's a very unhealthy situation for the Middle East to be in. On the plus side, the Biden administration is coming in with a very strong diplomatic team, and hence there's a lot of capacity to negotiate. But in order to be a successful negotiator, you have to be able to cast a long shadow, to project strength and a stiff kind of, a capacity. The risk, to my mind, is that the Biden administration might be perceived as the third Obama administration. Obviously, most of his team are from the Obama years, so there's that already. He himself, obviously, was Obama's vice president. And in the region, when Obama was tested, particularly in Syria, I would say he was stared down by a host of bad actors, if you want. Vladimir Putin, Khamenei of Iran, Hassan Nasrallah of Lebanon, Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad, Erdogan, even Iyad al-Baghdadian of ISIS. They stared down America and Syria, and they won. They got away with it and set a pattern that America really would not react. So that makes an incoming Biden administration potentially quite weak. So I would say it's important for President Biden to cut a figure independent of Obama's figure and to show that he wants to negotiate seriously, but he also has red lines and has a stiff backbone.
Ross, turning now to Iran specifically, it's central to two of the region's primary conflict axes with both Israel and Saudi Arabia. In regard to the latter, in a recent piece for MEI, you urged the new administration to adopt a more subtle diplomatic approach to stabilizing the region by helping to disentangle itself from the Iran-Saudi rivalry. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
If you look at the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia through the eyes of each of those actors, you will see that the United States is central in both. From Tehran's perspective, Saudi Arabia is really the tip of the spear of U.S. efforts to undermine Iran. So they don't see Saudi Arabia as an independent actor. On some issues they do, but mostly they don't. They see it as aligned with the United States. And therefore, that ramps up Saudi threat perceptions and also limits the potential for any kind of diplomatic activity involving Saudi Arabia. And if you look at the conflict through the eyes of Riyadh, it's similar. they see the United States as its backer, Saudi Arabia's backer. It sees the United States' footprint in the region as giving Saudi and the efforts of the Trump administration, the prior administration, to undermine diplomacy. They see all of these things as disincentives for actually having to deal with Iran. Now, that changed a bit after Iran sponsored attacks on the Abqaiq facilities, the Saudi Aramco facilities last year. That sort of jolted Saudi Arabia to understand that they need to deal with Iran and that they cannot rely on this notion of a security umbrella. So that, in some ways, by the fact that the United States didn't do anything, kind of jolted Saudi Arabia into seeing Iran as the actor that they have to deal with. But up until that point, I would say that the United States' involvement, both as a nemesis for Iran and as a protector for Saudi Arabia, has actually inhibited diplomacy. So that's why I say the United States has become a they've sort of triangulated the conflict. The United States has become a actor or protagonist in that conflict. And it hasn't necessarily led to anything positive. It's actually led to something negative. And what I said there is that what the United States needs to do is pursue subtle diplomacy that involves reducing the threat perceptions that Tehran sees from the United States, and also communicating with Saudi Arabia that they cannot hide behind a security umbrella and use the United States as an excuse for avoiding any kind of diplomatic rapprochement with Tehran.
Paul, negotiations with Tehran over reviving the 2015 nuclear deal are widely expected to be the central focus for the Biden administration in the Middle East. You highlighted some of the problems with the U.S. approach that changes every few years with every administration. I'm curious, how can the new administration approach these negotiations with Iran in a way that'll have the greatest impact on reducing regional tensions and craft a kind of more enduring deal?
I think, expectations have to remain limited. I do think there's a high probability that the U.S. and Iran will return to compliance with the JCPOA. It'll be a bit of a bumpy road because the Iranians, want more. They want reparations. They want lifting of all sanctions. They're tough bargainers, but at the end of the day, they would be happy if the U.S. returned to the JCPOA and lifted a great number of the sanctions that are directly linked to the JCPOA, but not all of them. But phase two, I think, will not get very far. In other words, I think there will be a return to sort of the old JCPOA. There might be a little bit of tweaking here and there, but then I don't think that there's a possibility of much progress on missile defense negotiations or Iran's proxy presence and intervention in the Middle East. I think the issue of limited time horizons that the Iranians are very well aware of, that whatever they negotiate with Biden is likely to be reversed by the next Republican administration. So there's not much incentive to do much. Also, that Iran is pretty invested in its current attitude, which is partly intensely ideological. And that relates to the internal politics, where the religious establishment, as well as the Revolutionary Guards, are wedded, sort of like, the Castros or the old Soviet ideological regime. They're wedded to an ideological hostility to the U.S. and to Israel that they cannot afford. They cannot afford a glasnost. They cannot afford, like the Chinese Communist Party, abandoning, essentially communism. They can't do that for domestic reasons. And secondly, their deployments in the region, which are partly ideological, but also very much, in their view, forward defense. In their view, the U.S. sooner or later wants regime change in Tehran. In their view, Israel sooner or later wants regime change in Tehran. In their view, the Arab states, which have now, the Gulf states, basically many of them moved into what Iran sees as alliance and normalization with Israel, that they too, Iran suspects, wants regime change. So the Iranians have such a paranoid, maybe partly realistic view of the world and they know that their conventional defenses are no match for the U.S., Israel, and now even the Gulf states, that they have this aggressive, asymmetric forward defense, presence in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. They're not going to walk away from that. So, the progress that can be made in 4 years, I think, is limited. What's important, though, I think, is for the Biden administration to look at, the short term and try to align it with long-term goals that Biden might not be around to implement, but nudge the region in the right direction rather than nudging it in the wrong direction. The right direction is nudging the region towards reducing or eliminating the use of proxy forces or militias. For a long while, it was only Iran who was doing that. Now everybody's doing it. Turkey has its militias. UAE has its militias. Saudi Arabia has its. Qatar supported many. We've got to roll back the use of militias and proxies as the thing to do. Keep in mind, the US supported militias and proxies in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. So we have to, in the long term, nudge the region back to the idea that it's got to be states, Westphalian states, clear states with clear boundaries. Secondly, we have to make clear that the region has to move towards de-escalation and towards integration and coordination and cooperation. One positive dynamic there, I think, is the normalization between Israel and a number of Arab states. Even though that makes life more difficult for the Palestinians, it is important that at least in one big conflict axis, the players have figured out, yes, they have their differences on certain issues, but they can cooperate and they should cooperate. I hope that this breakthrough of cooperation is not just in order to escalate another conflict with Iran, which it looks like it is, but rather breakthrough into the concept of cooperation. That sure, the Arab states and Iran have differences. All states have differences, but they should work towards cooperation. The US in the past, and certainly in the Trump administration, certainly poured fuel on the fire of regional conflict. And I think the US should now work towards encouraging the states, and it'll take a long time to build confidence, to work in that direction.
Following up on that, how do you think the new administration can build on the Abraham Accords in a positive way as a tool to facilitate further regional cooperation, as opposed to, as you suggested, just sort of shoring up a wider anti-Iranian alliance?
Well, I would just note two things, that the Biden administration must work on two axes. One, for the Palestinians, the Biden administration must move energetically, and it is, I think, going to revive support for the Palestinian Authority, relations with the Palestinians, and press both the Palestinians and the Israelis to resume bilateral negotiations, and to get the new Arab states that now have normalized relations with Israel to be part of that process, to encourage both Israel and Palestinians, and to maybe help both the Israelis and the Palestinians to get to or move forward towards a two-state solution of some kind. It'll be complicated, but the alternative is very destabilizing for the region. Israel is hardening into an apartheid state, which will not have a stable future. The issue of Jerusalem remains a powder keg. If anybody thinks that the fate or the status of Jerusalem is unimportant, hasn't been paying attention for the last 2,000 years. It is important. It needs a resolution other than what Trump proposed. And the idea that Israel is a state which up to this day hasn't declared what its borders are, continues to take other people's property and plan to annex it to its own, continues to basically perform under the principle of might is right. I want to take it, I take it. That is so profoundly destabilizing to the region, those principles. So Turkey says, well, then I'll take, parts of Syria, parts of Iraq, Iran, can claim parts of this and that. If that's the principle that Israel is applying, that is a very destabilizing principle. So I think the Biden administration should pivot to make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front and pressure Israel to finalize its borders, to give the Palestinians their own state. It could be, have some limitations on this and that, but they need their own state. Regionally, I think the Biden administration should move quickly, also in a broader scope, to make sure that the Israeli Gulf relationship, which is very important and productive in terms of economics and trade and technology and health and security and defense, does not become simply an escalating, a route of escalation of conflict with Iran that doesn't lead directly towards more conflict. Initially, it will, because both sides will be emboldened and sort of in a position to want to go at it. And that's very dangerous for the region and for the U.S. as well.
I just want to add, if you don't mind, Alistair, just to add to Paul's comments, that in my previous comment about the Iran-Saudi Arabia relationship, I was essentially arguing that the U.S. do less, that the U.S. being a protagonist in the conflict has muddied the conflict and made it more intractable. But I do think on the Abraham Accord side, the United States actually can play a very constructive role. And as Paul said, the natural instinct on the part of Israel and the Gulf Arabs will be to use the Abraham Accords as sort of a cudgel against Iran. So I think one of the things the United States can do is try to envision and then act upon the notion that the Abraham Accords are a sub-regional conflict mitigation structure that can be built upon. Paul and I penned a book together, an edited volume a few years ago called From Chaos to Cooperation, where we looked at the prospects for regional integration. And one of the things that we talked about was using sub-regional structures to build broader forms of cooperation, that to come to the table with an all-encompassing regional security economic architecture probably was not in the offing, but that we could take pieces of agreements. In this case, it would be Morocco, Israel, UAE, Israel, Bahrain, Israel, Sudan, Israel, and ultimately maybe even Saudi Arabia and Israel. Use that structure as a foundation for a broader form of regional cooperation. Maybe not today, but in the future. And so I think the thing that the United States can do is start sending those signals now. That, as Paul said, that the Abraham Accord should not be used as a cudgel against Iran. It should be used as a platform for building broader forms of cooperation between the Arab world and Israel, but then also as a platform involving other actors, including the Arab countries, including Israel, but also including Turkey and Iran.
Ross, on that last point, we've talked a lot about the Gulf and Iran and Israel, but we haven't really touched much on Turkey, which is at the kind of crux of one of the other major regional conflict axes with kind of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Do you think the recent rapprochement in the Gulf between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar will help to facilitate broader de-escalation with Turkey? And what should the U.S. do to support that?
It's a great question, and I would say I would be modest in terms of expectations that the rapprochement between Qatar and Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt will somehow create some kind of broader opportunity. First of all, I would look at it more as a truce than any kind of real rapprochement. I think there's a truce between Qatar and the other Arab states, but I think some of the underlying tensions are still there. So in terms of affecting the conflict in Libya, for example, or helping de-escalate tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think I would be very, very modest in terms of my expectations in that regard. But I go back to my earlier comment, Alistair, and that is that when we think about the actions of Turkey or the actions of Qatar, yes, we can look at the ambitions of Erdogan, we can look at the ambitions of Qatar, we can look at the ambitions of Iran, and those are fine in terms of thinking about mitigating conflict. But I think if we understand that Turkey, too, is caught up in this conflict vortex that Paul and I have written about, and that part of the question of further de-escalation involves, yes, the moving of the players, of the geostrategic plates in the region, as you kind of mentioned, but also addressing the broader structural problem in the region, and that this is a conflict system that has to be de-escalated more broadly, and not just and expecting one particular movement, particularly this movement within the GCC, to have a positive effect on Libya or have a positive effect on or on the Eastern Mediterranean. I think our expectations should be at least modest in that regard. For that reason, and also because in covering this region over the last 30 or so years, you become very, very cautious in terms of seeing, expecting leaders. We tend to expect leaders to miss opportunities rather than to parlay them into future successes.
Paul, turning to the issue of proxy conflict specifically, and you've touched on this earlier, if Iran and the U.S. can work out a deal to revive the JCPOA and reduce tensions, how far do you think that would go toward lowering the temperature of regional proxy conflicts? What impact would it have on say, Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen?
I think potentially it could lower the intensity. Definitely part of that intensity is driven by U.S.-Iranian tensions and perceptions of threat. When the U.S. is pressing Iran hard, Iran pushes back in Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen or other places, and we've seen that again and again. So that's part of the dynamic. We have to not discount that Iranian politics and Iranian decision making is a big driver as well. I think President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif obviously represented slightly more the moderate, pragmatic side of the Islamic Republic. Iran is facing presidential elections in June. The trend seems to be towards a hardline result to that election, and that could be, a negative in terms of regional stability. But I think, practically speaking, the Biden administration, in dealing with Iran, should be realistic that, yes, I think there can be a return to the nuclear agreement, which is important to keep a nuclear weapon off the table. But I think Iran is not going to be open to any rolling back or any removal of its presence in 4 or 5 Middle Eastern. It's going to be there, unfortunately. And I think the combination, that what diplomacy is basically a combination of pressure and negotiation. Diplomacy doesn't mean just let's sit down and talk. It means using all the levers of power to get to a certain result. And I think the strategy needs to be to continue to have pressure on Iran, to indicate that its presence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, to name a few major countries, remains a violation of international law, remains completely unacceptable, and remains something that will be sanctioned and rejected by the US and other players. Secondly, in those countries, it needs to find a balance between rolling back some of that influence so that Iran is not as dominant in Iraq or as dominant in Lebanon or as dominant in Yemen, while at the same time not escalating those conflicts. So that's, it's tricky, but that's what diplomacy is all about, sort of limited gains in the few years that Biden has, but always signaling that at the end of the day, if Iran wants to be accepted as a state, it has to behave as a state. It has to hence limit itself to being behind its own borders. It can have a military, it can have all kinds of things, but it cannot simply have deployments around the region as part of a above board, very proud deployment. Other countries are doing it. They should also be sanctioned and pushed back. UAE is largely withdrawn from Yemen. Turkey proudly deploys mercenaries to Libya. All of that has to be made very clear by the US that this is completely unacceptable, that this form of policy is not a tool that is to be accepted. So it might be the policy would be push back with diplomacy.
Ross, we're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to ask about your outlook for the region. How optimistic are you that we'll see a significant reduction in tensions or conflict over the coming 4 years?
Thanks, Alistair. I'm not particularly optimistic, and that probably comes from just the nature of looking at this region. But I have to say that there are some pieces that might give us some pause in terms of our pessimism. I think the Abraham Accords, even though they're not a peace treaty, they are an agreement, a sub-regional agreement involving the Arabs and the Israelis. And the possibility of that being, as I mentioned earlier, a platform for broader forms of cooperation remain. They could be used negatively in terms of a cudgel against Iran, which I'm counseling against, or they can be used positively. So I think that's a piece, an asset that we have in the region that could be used positively going forward. I think also the fact that we emerged from the Trump administration without a major war in the Middle East. I mean, yes, we've got civil wars ongoing in the Middle East, but not a major regional conflagration, I think is a positive. And the fact that the Biden administration is going to use, as Paul said, a combination of the at least the potential for force, but also negotiations, gives us ability to rebalance the U.S. role in the region and possibly even rebalance the balance of power, if you will, among the regional actors. So I think that if you take the Abraham Accords, you take sort of a rebalanced approach from the United States and the possibility of some political changes occurring in some of the countries, Turkey, Iran, in the next 4 to 6 months, I think we can at least see some of the pieces of what a future might look like. Whether those pieces come together, whether the political stars align and the strategic stars align, is something that we will have to wait and see. And hopefully the Middle East Institute will be able to at least contribute to that dialogue and play a positive role in that regard.
Paul, any final words before we conclude?
No, I would concur with Ross. I mean, it's hard to be optimistic. There are some, glimmers of progress, both regionally and in some of the countries, but it remains, a very dysfunctional and troubled region, as we started off by saying. I am optimistic in the sense that I think the Biden administration has the right approach. And I do think that diplomacy and leading with diplomacy is not only important for the United States, but is a lesson that needs to be learned by the countries of the region. That if Turkey and Saudi Arabia have problems, they should sit down and talk. If Iran and Saudi Arabia or Iran and others have problems, they should negotiate. The region has gotten so used over the decades, whenever anybody has a disagreement with anybody else, they either go to direct conflict or proxy conflict, and they bring in external powers. That has to break. So I'm not I'm not optimistic, but I think there are areas where progress can be made. Let me end by sort of a plea that we haven't mentioned, was that as the U.S. gets more focused on great power competition, and that's normal, that's understandable, that not translate into open-ended, importing great power conflict into the Middle East. That there are areas in the Middle East where naturally the US and China and Russia might compete, but there are also areas where they need to agree and cooperate in order to encourage their partners and encourage countries in the region to cooperate. If we simply start a new cycle of global conflict and global competition in the Middle East, we're going to make the problems worse, not better. And I'll end with that. And thank you, Alistair. And it's been great to be on with Ross.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you both very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Alistair.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.